Year 8, greetings, welcome back to Edgar Poe and the last lesson of Telltale Heart, where we'll find out what happens after the two men, the old man and the younger, irritated man, come to blows. The younger being known as a sociopath. What is a sociopath? Do you remember? Well, if you don't, a sociopath is someone who has something of a personality disorder where they don't consider the effect of their actions or words on other people. So somebody who demonstrates very antisocial behavior. For example, the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland, how did she exhibit sociopathic behavior? How did she behave in that final, the last few pages of Alice in Wonderland? Well, what did she do to the guards who didn't paint the flowers the right way? She said, off with their heads. What did she do with the sportsmen and the croquet players who couldn't hit the hedgehog? She said, off with their heads. Executing people who aren't playing a sport properly is sociopathic. We also looked at neuroses in last lesson. What are neuroses? These are obsessions. It's behavior, it's distracted, anxious behavior that shows that you're obsessed about one thing in particular. And what structural technique does Edgar Allan Poe use to show the narrator's neuroses? Edgar Poe, remember, the father of American literature, he wrote Telltale Heart. What structural technique? Remember the repetition, the exclamation marks. I open the door so gently. That obsession with detail, the obsession with his own brilliance, cunningly, so cunningly. Repetition, exclamation marks. Gesticulation, and what is that? It's a gesture to show someone's personality or what they're thinking. It's gesture, hand gestures, head gestures, body language. Gesture used instead of speaking to emphasize one's words. So we're going to look at how gesticulation is used by our narrator later on. But if somebody's being secretive, look at the new question at the bottom right. What gesticulation accompanies secrecy? So I leave this to you to think about. Imagine someone who's hiding something. What body language, what mannerisms, what do they do with their hands, their face? And if someone is neurotic, again, what gesticulation would you expect to see? If they're obsessed with detail, if they can't let something go, if they're distracted by something, what gesticulation would you expect to see? Look forward to your answers. Um, Today we're going to be reminded of Edgar Allan Poe. Yes, folks, again, he's such an impressive writer in the way he structures his text. I thought I'd remind you of it in case you want to use some of his techniques in your own writing. And then we'll write about how insanity is presented in the story, the second half of the story. So let's look again at how Edgar Allan Poe creates a literary work, because let's face it, a good story will land you anything up to half marks in a GCSE paper, language paper, I should say. So a well-structured story is worth a lot of points, and I suppose a lot of money if you become writers. So Edgar Poe had about six rules actually. He said, first I choose the length of the story. It has to be short enough to read in one sitting. Then he said, I choose the effect. So the effect here is he wants to appall, horrify the reader. So every sentence has to have the sense that we're reading about a shocking individual. Third line down, I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. So we're dealing with a cool sociopath, shocking character. So the tone has to be mad in this case. So he wants to infuse words like madness, mad, cunning, sense of. So the tone is one of madness or insanity. Again, that shapes his writing. So he wants to write sentences that create this sense of madness and insanity. The unique structural device is repetition. Last line, you cannot imagine how stealthily. So that's the structural device. In The Raven, Poe has a single word, nevermore, that's repeated over and over again. But then he decides, how do I want to deliver this repetition, this structural device? Be it exclamation marks or quotation marks or repetition. I need to choose what character the structural device will have. Basically, who is going to say it? In this case, it's the narrator who says so cleverly, so cunningly. It's the narrator who says he was stone dead. In The Raven, it's a raven that says this repeated word, nevermore. Then I decide why the structural device is needed. In this case, it's because we need the narrator to boast about his cleverness, to boast about his cunning. So can you see he uses the repetition of so to show how the character feels he's brilliant or clever or cunning. So we're soon going to jump back across to the story in Word, and I'm going to ask you to write this question first. How does Poe present the narrator's insanity? So I'll just give you a few seconds to write this down. How does Poe present the narrator's insanity? How does Edgar Allan Poe present the narrator's insanity? You might look at repetition. You might look at gesticulation. In fact, I urge you to look at those two concepts today. Okay, the next one is a model, but we'll look at the models after we look at the text. So let's identify some of the narrators, identify some examples of the narrator's insanity. So let's jump over to Word as we're doing that. Let me remind you that we left both the narrator and the elderly gent in the darkness. It was the beating of the, line 55, it was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of the drums simulates a cold shoulder into courage. That's where we left it last week. So they're alone in the darkness. We'll read a paragraph, make some notes, another paragraph, make some notes. We'll do the same thing following the murder and the interrogation. So first of all, let's look at the murder. But even yet I framed and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. The eye, I should say, sure. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. A tattoo is a beat. Rat-a-tat-tat. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. So they're sitting in the darkness. This narrator fancies he can hear the old man's heart beating so loudly that, in fact, other people can hear it as well. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound, so he's suffocating him here. This, however, did not vex me. It did not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I moved the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there. Many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. Let's make some notes then. Quicker and quicker. I'm going to focus on repetition, as you probably gathered from what I've highlighted. So I suggest you highlight these as well. Let's highlight quicker and quicker. Now, it's the heartbeat grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. It creates suspense, doesn't it? It's the idea. That's the pace. Panic. by emphasizing words quicker. The writers use repetition to emphasize certain points. So, but the beating grew louder and louder. So in this case, repetition reinforces how uncomfortably loud. The heartbeat seems. The writer almost suffuses, which means weaves this idea of this loud heartbeat through the text. So it reinforces how uncomfortably loud the heartbeat beats. Returns this structural device of the loud heartbeat. Here, stone dead is going to be important later because the writer is going to come back to the idea of the man being not quite dead, but here he's convinced. Let's say convinced his victim is dead. So he's convinced his victim is dead. Repetition means certainty. Stone dead, yes, he's stone dead, but later on, he may not be stone dead. Let's look at the second paragraph. So this is how he conceals the murder. Line 70, if you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all, ha ha. When I had made an end of all these labours, it was 4 o'clock, still as dark as midnight, and as the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men. Who do you think they're going to be? 3 men. There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity. Do we know what suave means? It means sophisticated, smooth, charming. Perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night. A suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been logged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search. Search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues and their tiredness, while I myself, in the wild audacity, bravery of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. So, my friends, the murderer is sitting above the victim on the floorboards, hosting a conversation of the police who've been alerted by that single scream. Yet, he is so confident he's committed the perfect crime. He's chatting to them charmingly. Look at this quite dispassionate way that he says, remember, we're focused on insanity and how the writer presents the narrator's insanity. So what have I written on my notes? First of all, this is let's say, detached from the brutality he explains method of disposal. So he says, first of all, then and then again, describing how he cuts up dismembers the body, heads and arms. Apologies for the graphic nature of the story. Remember, after all, this is the father of the detective story. So, if Sherlock Holmes chases brutal killers, then the inspiration for him, almost, came from this man. I then replaced the floorboard so cleverly, so cunningly. The repetition is used to boast about how he's able to conceal his crime. Used to boast. Concealment. Let's say boast about the intelligence of the concealment. Sorry if you're very fast at writing. Intelligence of the concealment can't be intelligent, so repetition used to boast about the intelligent method of concealment. Yeah, sorry if you had to make any corrections, but it's worth getting these points right. The old man mentioned line 81. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. How is repetition used? Well, here he's asking them. He's so confident in the search. He wants to draw our attention to the how he's inviting the officers, the police officers, to investigate or to look for the body or to look for the source of the noise. So the murderers, the narrator, so again, my apologies, the narrator, because we're talking about the narrator, emphasizes the narrator's confidence. I have to move something out of the way. Emphasizes the narrator's confidence in. So that's the deception. Let's look at the discovery. In 86, the officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things, but ere long, which means before long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached. Remember gesticulation now. So one of the questions later is what gesticulation? I think for my class, I'd like you to look at what gesticulation the character demonstrates, and it's all coming up in this paragraph. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat still and chatted. They sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. What could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound. What is this sound? What can he hear? Perhaps something beneath him. Line 93. Much a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, which means violently, but the noise steadily increased. I rose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they be not gone? Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated upon the boards. My class, look at these gesticulations, swinging the chair. Line 97. But the noise arose overall and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God! No, no, they heard. They suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony, anything more tolerable than this derision. I could bear. Oops, my words crashed. I was really hoping this wouldn't happen. So let's. I think you might be able to. What I can see is a blurred screen, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to wait for this to wake up again. But my computer promised it wouldn't do that. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark, louder, louder, louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the clap, tear up the planks, here is the beating of his hideous heart. Our narrator is so convinced he can hear, and the detectives can hear, a heartbeat beneath the floorboards, that he confesses, he reveals the dead body of the man. And that's where the story ends, you see. As we know, Edgar Poe only wants to write stories that can be read in a single sitting. So let's look at some repetition again. Remember, Poe's structural device is to use repetition. So the ringing was more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. So this is the idea that something can be heard. So the repetition again. You have a few options when you're writing how insanity is presented. You could say the writer uses repetition, for example, to convey the thoughts that the sound could be heard. So repetition shows how persistent was the sound, is the sound. Always write in the present tense when you're talking about a story, because a story is always happening. The plot's always unfolding for someone who's reading it. No, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. Again, the repetition of they. Well, there's repetition of no as well. But anyway, the point is that this narrator uses repetition. I'm trying to highlight once more. There it is. Okay. So it suggests that there's a body of men working against them. The police officers are presented as one unified body, even though there are three of them. So they presents the officers as one persistent body of men. They're all working in tandem, they're working together. They heard, they suspected, they. It almost makes the three seem like nine, because there are three theys. So it presents the detectives as one body, one persistent body of men. There are other examples of repetition. I foamed, I raved, I swore. Louder, louder, louder. But you're getting the idea now that Edgar Allan Poe chooses this structural device of repetition to convey insanity. Louder, louder, louder. Let's work on this. We could use the exclamation marks as well, but I was told once that the more exclamation marks you use in your writing, the madder it seems. So that was in relation to emails. Anyway, louder, louder. The repetition of the exclamation marks. Repetition and exclamation marks reinforce how uncomfortable the hallucination is. Repetition and X. Let's convey extreme discomfort. In other words, insanity. He is using exclamation marks because he's lost control. So there, friends, are a few examples, mainly of repetition and exclamation marks, that show the narrator is insane. Let's go back now and look at how we could answer that question. Did I give you the question? I think I did. How does Poe present the narrator's insanity? I hope you've written it down. We're going to look at some examples now. So, what if I used louder, louder, louder? Let's look at louder, louder. Poe presents his narrator's insanity when, I think you can use that as a stock sentence opener. I suggest you write 2 of these paragraphs. Poe presents his narrator's insanity when he describes the heart beating louder, 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 louder. What did we say about louder, louder, louder? Well, the repetition emphasizes successfully how intrusive the imaginary sound is on the narrator's thoughts. Or you could say the repetition emphasizes that he's lost, that he's focused on the sound of the heartbeat. Or you could look at the exclamation marks, emphasize how he's lost control of his emotions. Should we look at another sentence? How about cleverly, so cunningly, or stone dead? Let's look at stone dead. How is that repetition effective? Do we remember what we said? So stone dead. I want to leave PowerPoint and jump back to Word. We're nearly done, folks. We'll be done in 3 minutes. What did we say about stone dead? He was stone dead. Convinced his victim is dead. Repetition means certainty. So that's going to be effective later because he believes that the man's still alive. So Poe presents his narrator's insanity when he describes the man as stone dead. The repetition is effective later because the narrator is convinced at this point. Remember, repeating stone means it's convinced. He's convinced. He's convinced that the man is lifeless, so we'll be shocked to imagine he hears his heart beating later on. So 2 choices, 2 models. Over to you. Choose another one of those quotations that we've highlighted. Either go back in the video or use your own text that you may have highlighted as we've gone on. Or Edgar Allan Poe. Good. Father of the detective novel, no less. Finally, list 3 examples of how the narrator's gesticulation conveys the writer's insanity. I'd like my class to at least answer this question. If you're in the higher sets, I strongly recommend you write 2 PEEs using our notes. See you next week or tomorrow, Tuesday morning, if you want to talk about any of this live.